Utah, Mr. Pence of Indiana, Mr. Rose of Tennessee, Mr. Rouser of North Carolina, Mr. Yacom of Indiana.
Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 9th, 2023, the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Sherfilis McCormick, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Minority Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include any extraneous material on the subject of the special order hour.
Without objection.
For the next 60 minutes, we have a chance to speak directly to the American people on issues that are of great importance to the Congressional Black Caucus, Congress, the constituents we represent, and all Americans. I rise today for the Tennessee Three, who stood in the face of bigotry and vitriol to fight for the communities they serve. After 6 lives were lost due to gun violence in Nashville, the Republican-led Tennessee legislature expelled 2 black lawmakers who stood with families, teachers, and students to demand a solution. What happened to Representative Justin Pearson and Representative Justin Jones is an utter disgrace. This expulsion was a blow to our democracy and underscores the legislature's flagrant disrespect for the First Amendment rights. The families of those who lost loved ones in the Covenant School shooting deserve real legislation and solutions, not bigotry and petty politics. As elected officials, it is our solemn responsibility to keep our communities safe from gun violence. But extreme Republicans have other priorities, protecting their NRA instead of our children and silencing the voices of our black leaders. Extremist Republicans continue to look the other way as our schools become firing ranges, as our movie theaters become firing ranges, as our places of worship become firing ranges. It should provide us with some comfort that both of these lawmakers expelled were recently reinstated with unanimous support. Local leaders in Shelby County and Nashville were able to see through the hatred and recognize that Representative Pearson and Jones were fighting for their constituents. However, not forgetting that what happened in Tennessee legislature can happen in any community, anywhere in our country. Any state could be next, including my home state of Florida. And we cannot forget about why Justin Jones and Justin Pearson were expelled in the first place. They were fighting for an answer to end gun violence epidemic that wreaks havoc in all communities in our country. Nashville, like so many other cities, have been touched by this crisis. Families in South Florida know it all too well after a gunman entered the grounds of Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School and took 17 innocent lives in 2018. Enough is enough. I urge Congress to come together in passing an assault weapons ban before more lives are lost. This senseless violence can no longer be left unaddressed. I would like to yield to my colleague, the Honorable Jonathan Jackson from Chicago.
Thank you, Congresswoman McCormick. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to confront a multitude of challenges that have relentlessly gnawed at the very soul of our nation. The devastating plague of gun violence, the erosion of our democratic values, and the insidious persistence of racism that continues to cast its dark shadow over our society. As we stand today, heavy hearts with sorrow, we remember the innocent lives lost in the tragic mass shooting at the Covenant School in Nashville. 3 young children and 3 adults were mercilessly taken from us, leaving a void in their families and communities that can never be filled. The Metropolitan Nashville Police Department identified the victims as Evelyn DeCarcos, 9 years of age, Haley Scruggs, 9 years of age, William Kinney, 9 years of age, Catherine Contz, 60, Cynthia Peak, 61, Mike Hill, 61. In the wake of this unspeakable tragedy, the Tennessee State Legislature, a body that was meant to protect its citizens and uphold the values of this great nation, chose to abdicate its responsibilities. Instead of working tirelessly to keep their community safe from the horrors of gun violence, they opted for an unprecedented and unjust course of action, expelling 2 black members of the Democratic caucus who stood with families, who stood with teachers, and who stood with the will of the students in their righteous demand for gun safety reform. Representative Justice Jones and Representative Justin Pearson, two black and duly elected representatives, were silenced, their voice snuffed out like the candles in a storm. The GOP-led House's action have sent a chilling message that racism, the vile scourge that has blighted our nation's history, is still live and well. My fellow colleagues, it is high time we stand up and speak truth to power. We must stand tall, shoulder to shoulder, and declare that we will no longer tolerate this blatant racism and anti-democratic behavior. We will not let the echoes of the past define our present, nor dictate our future. To truly understand the gravity of the situation in Tennessee, we must delve into the sordid history of state legislatures in the South and their treatment of black lawmakers. During the Reconstruction era, we saw the rise of black political representation. However, this progress was met with fierce resistance from the white supremacists who sought to maintain their grip on power. In Georgia, 32 black legislators known as the original 33 were expelled from the General Assembly in 1868. They were among the first African-American state legislators in the United States. 24 of their members were ministers. Their only crime was the color of their skin. This blatant act of racism sets a dangerous precedent for future generations. In the turbulent times of the civil rights and anti-war movements, Mr. Julian Bond, a key figure in the founding of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, was elected to the Georgia House of Representatives in 1966. Amidst the struggle for justice and equality, the Georgia House refused to seat Mr. Julian Bond, alleging that his opposition to the Vietnam War rendered him unfit to serve. It took a Supreme Court ruling to overturn the decision and affirm Bond's right to serve in the state legislature. Moreover, we cannot forget that even the United States Congress has denied African-American lawmakers their rights to seats. It was on February 27, 1869, Congress rejected John Willis Menard, the first black man elected to the House of Representatives. Mr. Menard, a poet, a newspaper publisher, and politician, secured a resounding victory in Louisiana's 2nd Congressional District in November 1868. Despite his triumph, his election was met with fierce opposition led by the defeated white candidate Caleb S. Hunt. Then Congressman James Garfield argued it was too soon, quote, for a Negro, close quote, to join the Congress and that the seat should be declared vacant to save the $5,000 salary. As a result, Mr. Menard was never seated, and his constituents were denied representation until the next election. It is both disheartening and infuriating that even after more than 150 years since the end of the Civil War, we continue to grapple with the same injustices that have plagued our nation since its inception. Racism remains deeply entrenched in our society, and the expulsion of the Representative Justin Jones and Representative Justin Pearson in Tennessee is a stark reminder that our struggle for equality, justice, and fair representation is far from over. We as a nation have not made as much progress as we should have, despite the countless sacrifices of our forebears. Black people in America continue to face systemic oppression and are silenced in various forms. The legacy of slavery, segregation, sedition, and racial violence casts a long shadow over our society. However, it is in the face of adversity that we find our strength. Throughout history, black Americans have persevered, united, and fought for their rights, standing tall against the forces that sought to silence them. From the brave men and women who stood up against racial segregation to the pioneering lawmakers who broke barriers in the state legislatures and Congress, their resilience and determination have paved the way for future generations. Now it's our turn to carry the torch of progress. We must stand to demand an end to the injustices that continue to suppress the voices of our brothers and our sisters. We must actively dismantle the structures that perpetuate racism and inequality, ensuring that every citizen, regardless of the color of their skin, has the opportunity to thrive and make their voices heard. Let us draw inspiration from those who have come before us and have forged a new path towards a brighter future. Let the blood parallels Let the bold parallel to the past guide us as we reshape the narrative, ensuring that the sacrifices of our ancestors were not made in vain. It is our responsibility as a nation to guarantee that every American, irrespective of race, has the right to be heard, respected, and valued. We are one nation, indivisible, bound by our shared history and our common aspirations. Let us rise together and demand change, not only for ourselves, but for our children and our children's children. We must break the chains of injustice and the cycle of discrimination and ensure that our voices, the voices of Black Americans and all marginalized people, will never again be silenced. Mr. Speaker, I yield my time back to the Honorable Congresswoman McCormick.
Thank you so much. I would like to yield to my colleague, the Honorable Yvette Clarke from New York's 9th District.
I thank the gentlelady from Fort Lauderdale, Florida, Ms. McCormick, for yielding time. I thank my colleague, Jonathan, for co-anchoring this evening's special order hour. Mr. Speaker, I rise on this day praying for the speedy recovery of 16-year-old Ralph Yarl of Kansas City, Missouri, who was released from the hospital today after being shot in the head for ringing the wrong doorbell. We live in a society today where more and more communities are living in a reoccurring nightmare, reeling from gun violence. Now, gun violence is the #1 killer of children in the United States of America. And while it has always been Black communities that have borne the brunt and the most victimized and terrorized by gun violence, and have too often assumed the blame of a poorly regulated gun industry, I truly expected that there would have been some bipartisan action taken to protect the next generation after the tragedy at Sandy Hook all those years ago. Instead, the far right stays licking the boot of the NRA, taking their blood money and looking the other way. It has been crystal clear, it has become crystal clear that the right-wing Republicans could care less. It is unconscionable that they care so little for the lives of children. I mean, look at what has happened just this past week. Tennessee, Kentucky, Alabama, mass murder, mass casualties have become commonplace, but we can't make it normalized. It is not lost upon me that 2 Black lawmakers, Representatives Justin Jones and Justin Pearson, were expelled from the Tennessee House after joining peaceful protests against gun violence. Another generation who have had to grow up doing gun violence drills in their schools has now taken leadership and is leading the charge. So let's be clear. The CBC won't stand by and allow another Jim Crow era to take root while further GOP legislatures abuse their power, as we saw in Tennessee. The CBC will continue to push back against any and all efforts by Republicans to subvert the will of the American people, whether it is the effort to overturn our election on January 6th or efforts to silence or expel members from state houses who advocate for a better nation, a better America, safe from the horrors of gun violence. Let me thank the gentlelady from Fort Lauderdale, Florida, for yielding me the time. I thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I would like to yield to my colleague, the Honorable Donald Payne from New York's 10th District.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the gentlelady from Florida and the gentleman from Illinois for leading this special order hour, which is a great responsibility given to them by the chairman of this body. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to address the recent expulsion of 2 elected members of the Tennessee legislature and the threat this action poses for American democracy. On April 6th, 2 black elected officials, Justin Jones and Justin Pearson, as we all know, were expelled from the Tennessee state legislature. They were involved in a peaceful protest to demand legislators pass stricter gun laws in the state. And why were they engaged in that peaceful protest? It's because their colleagues have tried to silence them on so many times during normal debate, in committee, and on the floor of the Tennessee legislature, that they finally had to take these actions in order to be heard. And they were expelled because of that protest. Mr. Speaker, I'm proud of those young men. They stood up for what they felt was right, and their opportunity as elected officials of that body to be heard. And if it took rebellion to be heard, a megaphone to be heard on the floor, then that's what they had to do. I was honored to be part of something similar that the Congressional Black Caucus led on this floor not too many years ago. I see my colleague Joyce Beatty here and my colleague Yvette Clark. We were both part of that rebellion. We sat down on the House floor, which is against the rules. But we sat down because of the same issue these young men spoke up for, gun violence, and we were tired. And John Lewis led us, as he had done so many times before, and we sat right down on that floor and held the House of Representatives for over 24 hours. Our colleagues tried to come back and disrupt us and scare us, but we were not unbowed. We continued to hold this floor until we had people understand that we were serious about this. Our children are being killed all over this nation. And the unfortunate thing that happens with so many of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, until it happens in their community, until it happens to their friends, until it happens to their family, they don't want to talk about it. They don't want to talk about it. But let it happen in their community and to their friends and to their family, we've got to do something. Just like the fentanyl problem, major problem in this country now. Been urban communities screamed about the opioid issue for 20 years, and nobody did anything. But now that it's impacting their families, now it's a health issue. We have to understand that all issues in this country should be looked at in that manner. These young men were brave, articulate, and made sense for their protests. The horrible and unnecessary gun violence that occurs every day in this country. In March, a former student entered Covenant School in Nashville and killed 3 students and 3 adults. The school was part of Nashville's Covenant Presbyterian Church. Like millions of Americans, Tennessee residents are sick and tired of gun violence. And I have many members behind me, so I will not belabor the point. But Mr. Speaker, when are we going to address this issue? When are we going to look? Majority of the people in this country say they are willing to have reasonable gun background checks to make sure criminals or people with mental illness do not have these weapons, because we're finding many times those are the people that are having these issues. So why can't we deal with that? It's not unreasonable. Every American has a Second Right Amendment to own a gun. But we make sure we keep guns out of certain people's hands, and that's what we need to do. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I'll yield back.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield to my colleague, the Honorable Joyce Beatty from Ohio's 3rd District.
Mr. Speaker, first let me say thank you to my colleagues, my friends, for chairing tonight's special order hour. To the gentlelady from Florida and to the gentleman from Illinois, thank you for speaking truth to power. Thank you for reminding us of our history. Thank you for reminding us why we are here tonight as we speak to the nation. And Mr. Speaker, I rise this evening to stand in solidarity with my members of the Congressional Black Caucus and with the Tennessee Three. I have this raised fist on this poster behind me saying, I stand with the hashtag Tennessee Three. You see, Mr. Speaker, as we speak truth to power tonight, in the face of an unspeakable tragedy which 6 Americans, 3 educators, and 3 babies, 9 years old, were murdered senselessly due to gun violence. The move by the Tennessee legislature to expel these lawmakers for using their voice to speak truth to power is unjust, undemocratic, and un-American. You will hear those words riddle through our chambers throughout the night. To silence lawmakers for standing up for the will of the people, that's not democracy. I am glad that my classmate, my colleague, and my friend, Congressman Donald Payne, reminded us of April 7 years ago in this very chamber, where in a full house, we had to sit in and stopped the Congress in an effort to get laws passed on gun violence, gun reform, because of the number of times we come to this chamber, we come to the floor's microphone, and we say, 1 minute of silence. We did it today, Mr. Speaker. And if Democrats and Republicans can come and stand in this chamber and in a solemn, hollow voice, beg us to pray for another mass shooting, beg us to stand together for 1 minute, 60 seconds in it, because lives have been lost to gun violence with assault weapons. I respect the Second Amendment, but I don't respect coming to this floor, and I don't respect the individuals that will not bring gun reform to this floor in legislation that will help us eradicate what we're living through. It's just not fair. If I had my way, I'd put a piece of legislation on the House floor that says we can't come to the floor and do a 1 minute when we're losing lives, because we can put something in place to make a difference. The expulsion of the state representatives Justin Jones and Justin Pearson, 2 Black duly elected members representing minority districts, makes it clear that racism is still alive and well in this nation. What happened in Tennessee's legislature was a blow to our democracy. If this can happen in Nashville, it can happen in any community in this country we call America. Republicans in Tennessee's legislature shut down the members for standing up for our children. Mr. Speaker, gun violence is a leading cause of death. Mr. Speaker, gun violence is an epidemic in our country. Inaction, Mr. Speaker, should not be an option. We need more leaders and officials standing in the front lines with the American people to ensure them that we are fighting to ban assault weapons, fighting to protect our children, fighting to protect our communities, and yes, fighting to protect our democracy. And that is exactly what the Tennessee Three did. 2 black men, young men, and a white woman stood together for justice. They fought to defend our democracy and the power of our voices. And yes, as you've heard, and I imagine will hear repeatedly again, just yesterday, another tragedy in this nation, taking the lives of 4 Alabama young people, 16 years old, going to a birthday party. And I imagine this week we will come to this floor again, Democrats and Republicans, and acknowledge that this should not have happened, and acknowledge that again we should bow our heads for 1 minute, 60 seconds. As a grandmother, as someone who has grandchildren who I hope can live to look to the future, I would hope that we would stand here and say for our children, if not for us as Republicans and Democrats, that we can stand together and come up with some type of legislation for gun reform. So let me end here by saying, yes, we should put gun violence at the forefront of our agenda. Mr. Speaker, it's simple. We should put people over politics. Because not bringing gun reform to this floor is simply a political maneuver. So let me say we stand here together as members of the powerful Congressional Black Caucus, and we remind you that you cannot expel justice and you cannot expel our voices. I yield back and thank you to my colleagues.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, can I inquire how much time is remaining?
The gentlewoman has 33 minutes remaining.
Thank you. I would like to yield to my colleague, the Honorable Ms. Sheila Jackson-Lee from Texas's 18th District.
I'm delighted, but sad, but empowered, but anguished, but yet fulfilled, but yet rising, but yet encouraged, but yet ready to fight this evening. And I thank the gentlelady from Florida for her distinguished leadership and friendship. I'm delighted as well from the gentleman from Illinois for his shining leadership and transformational changes that are happening in and around his district in Chicago. I'm honored with my other colleagues that are here, and I thank Chairman Horsford and Chairman Beatty, Emeritus of the Congressional Black Caucus, and I'm honored to again call the Congressional Black Caucus the conscience of the Congress, and yes, the conscience of the nation. We can say that because in our midst, we have had the Honorable John Lewis. Mr. Speaker, I want to go down memory lane just a bit, but as I do so, and before I speak to the irony of the connection of the Tennessee Three to the historical record, does anyone remember the Georgia 33 as we have been brought to highlight? 33 black legislators right after the Civil War, 1868, proud and standing tall because of some way of gaining the right to vote. And the people there, the freed slaves after the 13th Amendment was eliminated, ending slavery in the United States, our freed slaves could vote. Property owners, as I believe. And they elected 33 black legislators. and they were proud. Oh, you can see them with their button-down suits, speaking the best English that they could and fighting for their constituents. That is what we are to do here, listening to the ear and having the ear of their constituents. And yet, within a few moments of their great victory of election to the Georgia Assembly, they were expelled, thrown out because of the color of their skin, which began the demise of Reconstruction and the black codes and the horrors of the rage of the Klan and others leading into the 1900s. I'm reminded of George White, who stood on the floor in 1901, who had been drawn out of this Congress, member of Congress, and said the Negro will rise like the phoenix. And then in 1966, I'm still stunned, brilliant young man by the name of Julian Bond was duly elected by his constituents. He had their ear and they had his ear. Young man, and he had all the willingness to do what was right as an elected member of the Georgia Assembly, and he was expelled for his supporting of the fact of the SNCC, the organization that he previously led, indicating that the Vietnam War violated international law. He didn't speak of the soldiers, which I have repeatedly said, that our soldiers put on uniforms unselfishly. We never accuse them. They fight and they die. And they died in Vietnam from all communities, from the south to the north, the east to the west, from our backyards. But yet, because he expressed a democratic belief, meaning his right to a belief that might have been different, but because of democracy, he had the right to speak, he was expelled. Now we come to the fear and the absolute outrage of lack of understanding. I'm baffled by the expulsion of the Tennessee Three, Representative Pearson, Representative Jones, and Representative, as I recall, Johnson. And all they did was come to hear the ear of America's best, the youth, the children, crying out again, how much more bloodshed can we take? And the Congressional Black Caucus has been a leading force, joining with our colleagues. And let me say this tonight, Mr. Speaker. We come from the same state. Let me just say this. We all tend to oratory. We're passionate and emotional. But I believe after all these years and all the deaths of children, can we find even a sense of Congress that would lead us to be able to condemn gun violence as being the #1 killer of our children through homicide? And that the very fact that 4 children died and other innocent persons in Nashville just a mere couple of weeks ago, I want you to know that I feel personal pain when the news rises up in the early morning hours of what happened the night before or the weekend. I have a personal pain because my tenure here was a tenure during the assault weapons ban, but in the midst, there was Columbine. But the numbers showed that they went down, the assault weapons incidences. But now I'm living with Sandy Hook. I'm living with Parkland, Virginia Tech. I'm living with Texas Tech. I'm living with any number of those in Texas, from the Walmart to the church to Uvalde, where I went and walked with the families and went to funerals and cried and wondered, why are children dead, 19 of them? And so these young men in Tennessee were walking the pathway of the Georgia 33 and Julian Bond. As history reflects, they did nothing wrong, and these 3 individuals, one who was not expelled, did nothing wrong as well. They were representing their constituents. They were nonviolent. They were in the midst of civil disobedience. They could not be heard. They were on the floor, and one could do a lot of things. And so I come today to be able to join my colleagues and to, again, ask for the question of justice and democracy and freedom, and to be able to salute these 3 and to say that in their name, from Tennessee, now from Alabama, where teenagers were murdered. Can we not do our work on the floor of the House, from banning assault weapons, from passing a sensible storage bill, the Emily Vaughn storage bill, to getting rid of ghost bills, to making red flag law permanent and not voluntary, because that happened in Louisville, mental health concerns, and a number of other places. Can we not do this? I simply close with the respect to the late Representative John Lewis. I simply close and pay tribute to him, for it was before your tenure, Mr. Speaker, that we did take to the floor of the House to sit with his leadership in the pain of another shooting of children. Way back during Parkland, we couldn't take it anymore. I wonder if this is not the moment where we can find common ground. I'm going to look for my friends on both sides of the aisle to see whether we can find common ground on some form of gun safety legislation. And then I will say to those Tennessee 3, John Lewis said, never give in, never give out, never give up. I pay tribute to them and all others who have never given up, never given out, and never given in. God bless all of you, and I thank you, and I yield back. God bless the United States of America. Thank you.
I would like to yield to my colleague, the Honorable Lucy McBath from Georgia's 7th District.
Well, first I want to thank the Honorable Sheila Scherflis McCormick and also Jonathan Jackson on behalf of the CBC. Thank you so very much for standing on the front lines tonight for this very special hour. I rise this evening to address the frightening assault on democracy, which took place in the Tennessee legislature. In the days following the tragic shooting at the Covenant School, Representatives Justin Jones and Justin Pearson demanded action to keep their communities safe from gun violence. In the spirit of our dear departed friend, and as we've talked about him a great deal tonight, John Lewis, these lawmakers were doing nothing more than making good trouble. And in response, the Republican Party majority in Tennessee took measures to expel Representatives Jones and Pearson from their positions, undermining the will of the voters who sent them to Nashville. This is simply unconscionable. This is not how it works. This is not how democracy works. This is an attack on the very principle of representative democracy on which our nation was founded. Our children are being murdered in their classrooms. And rather than work on solutions to prevent these senseless tragedies from happening again and again and again, Republican leaders in Tennessee opted to expel the lawmakers who are simply fighting for change, fighting to save lives, fighting to save lives of everyone in this country. Our children are being murdered in their classrooms. We watch it day in and day out. We watch it at birthday parties, on our front doorsteps, in their friends' cars as my son Jordan was murdered. We cannot look away from the tragedies that are devastating families all across this country. Shame on us. Shame on this body to turn a blind eye to the massacre of human life. Who have we become in this body that we have no thought for preservation of human life? And we cannot seek to silence the voices that are crying out for change, because we are not powerless. We have the power. We are the body. We have solutions to put an end to gun violence that claims over 100 Americans in this country every single day. Solutions that the majority of Americans support, that are crying out for. What happened in Nashville sets a very disturbing precedent. Efforts to silence duly elected representatives can happen in states all across this country. It happened right here in this very chamber. But the will of the American people will not be overturned. The efforts of those who would rather betray trust in our democratic institutions than fight to keep kids safe in our school, those efforts will fail. And we will continue our efforts to make good on the promise that we must fulfill for Americans' children. A better and safer America is what they deserve. It's truly possible if we have the will and the courage to do it. Representative Jones and Pearson are disruptors. And yes, for cultural change to make this community, our community, safer, it means disruption. That's how change happens. And as we talked about earlier, mentioning the sit-in with Representative John Lewis on the floor, when that happened, I was leading a rally outside the Capitol, disrupting, to make sure that people's voices were heard, to make sure that survivors and victims like me have the ability to express and ask this body to do what's right. The time has passed. It's long overdue. And over and over and over and over again, we come before this House and this body and ask people to stand up with courage and do the right thing. When will it happen? Do we have the courage to act? And I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to yield to my colleague, the Honorable Troy Carter from Louisiana's 2nd District.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. To my esteemed colleagues, Congresswoman McCormick from Florida, and my esteemed colleague, Representative Jackson from Illinois, I thank you for your leadership. I thank you for your commitment. I thank you for allowing us to have this opportunity to speak on such an important measure. I was outraged by what we all witnessed in Tennessee at the beginning of April, following the tragic mass shooting at the Covenant School. The Republican majority in the state legislature chose to avoid passing any meaningful gun reform or even having any meaningful discussion about gun reform. Instead, sought to thwart democracy, to silence the critics who stood with the community, who demanded action. Prayers are wonderful. I subscribe to them daily. Well-wishing is a wonderful thing, and they make you feel good. But that alone, without action, is not enough. We as elected officials are sworn to a task, to a duty, to serve, to provide. In Tennessee that day, we failed the people of Tennessee. We failed the people of America. Instead of action, they expelled 2 black Americans, members of the Democratic Caucus, who stood with parents, teachers, and students to demand action and to speak truth to power about the reality of gun violence. This was an attack on our democracy. And all of us, Republican, Democrat, and other, should be outraged with such an attack on democracy, because this issue today may have been an issue that the majority ruling party didn't like. What happens tomorrow when we unilaterally seek to silence the voices of duly elected people in a democratic society? Stop and think about that for a second, viewers. Stop and think about that, my friends. Stop and think about the threat to our democracy, the cornerstone, the pillar of our society is freedom of speech, freedom of expression, the ability to disagree and to have meaningful discourse. That's what we all ran on. That's what the mighty Constitution protects. Yet, in Tennessee, that was ignored. It was ignored. It was defiled. And everyone of every race and party should find disdain and pain with that kind of treatment in a democratic process. In the post-Civil War Reconstruction era, 4 members of the House, James Lewis, John Willis Maynard, PBS Pinchback, and Josiah Thomas Walls, were wrongly denied the right to take their seats. These egregious actions in Tennessee show us that the fight for black representation in the United States is still an ongoing battle. Our democracy is built on the freedom of speech and freedom to protest. To expel elected representatives for standing with their neighbors after an horrific act of gun violence against children is appalling. I'm enraged that it was 2 black lawmakers who were expelled. Black people in the United States have historically been vilified for speaking up. We've been beaten. We've been attacked by dogs. We've been hosed with powerful water hoses. We've been hanged from trees. And yet, in 2023, 2 duly elected members of a state legislature were unilaterally dismissed and removed from service for standing up with the people. There were no guns. There were no spears. There were no chokeholds. There were no fighting. There was no profanity. There was no broken windows or broken arms. It was mere words. Mere words that defended the Constitution of our land, that defended the people to protest against something as egregious as the death of children. And we say we don't need to do anything with gun control. You can't find one thing, my dear friends, on the other side. Can we find any one thing that we can come together on that would suggest that we hear the pain, we hear the cries, we see the eyes of black and white mothers and fathers who will never see their children again? Yet we continue to find a comfortable place in the shade and hide behind rhetoric. The time has come for us to do something, to act, to move, to show the American people that we will not continue to sit back and watch senseless killings on our streets. Look at the statistics. We have more mass murders in the year than we have days in this year. Doesn't that mean anything? Doesn't that cause you to cringe and say, no more? Black, white, Republican, Democrat. There are lots of things that we can agree to disagree on. Public safety should never be one, particularly when it comes to standing up for our young people. Today, we send a promise of action, and we ask you to join us in delivering on that promise of action. Today, I stand for justice. Today, I stand with the Justins. Today, I stand with the Tennessee Three. Today and every day, I invite you to join me and others in supporting the bare principle of democracy and protecting its people. I yield back.
Mr. Speaker, may I inquire how much time is remaining?
Minutes remaining.
I'd like to yield to my colleague, the Honorable Maxwell Frost from Florida's 10th District.
Thank you. I'm here today because I, like the rest of our nation, am outraged by what we have seen happen in Tennessee. 6 innocent people died as a result of senseless gun violence in Nashville, a school shooting that will never be forgotten where we lost children. And instead of banding together to honor these victims, to honor those families, to honor with action, real action that would save lives, Republicans in the Tennessee legislature took the racist step of expelling 2 black lawmakers who stood with the families, who stood with the students, who stood with the teachers and their constituents in demanding change. The only things that Representative Jones and Pearson are guilty of is doing the right thing, of standing with their people, their constituents who sent them to the state legislature to fight for their lives. And that's why they have already been unanimously reappointed to their positions by their people in their local governments. I can pray and act and fight for a day when we are more outraged that children were murdered in a pool of their own blood at school than we are having black folks that have the audacity to take up space in the halls of power. Well, guess what? Representative Jones and Pearson will continue to take up that space. Black lawmakers such as myself and my colleagues in this room will continue to take up that space. The people, children, who the leading cause of death in this country for is guns, will continue to take up that space. And as long as there's injustice, we will not be silent, and we will continue to fight for a world where no one has to have the fear of gun violence. I commend Representative Jones and Pearson. They are American heroes because they fight for a day where we can be safe. Thank you. I yield back.
I'd like to yield to my colleague, the Honorable Sidney Kamlager-Dove, from California's 37th District.
Thank you, and I would like to thank the gentle lady from Florida and the gentleman from Illinois for managing this very important special hour. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to discuss the blatantly anti-democratic and frankly racist expulsion of Tennessee Representatives Justin Jones and Justin Pearson. In response to the Covenant school shooting that claimed the lives of 3 innocent children and 3 staff members, Representatives Jones, Pearson, and Johnson protested on the floor of the Tennessee House. They were calling for long overdue, common-sense gun reform that would help save lives of children and keep our communities from becoming war zones. They engaged in good trouble, similar to what Congressman John Lewis did when he sat on this very floor to demand action to end gun violence. What the Tennessee Three did was righteous. Yet instead of joining the calls to keep our communities safe, extremist Republicans retaliated by expelling Representatives Jones and Pearson, 2 young black male lawmakers. Actions of civil disobedience by black men and women have been the impetus of change in our nation, from boycotts to peaceful protests to sit-ins. I know we like to romanticize the civil rights movement, but let's be clear. It was not long ago that dogs were sicked on young people for wanting the right to vote, and their disobedience was in nonviolently persisting. Representatives Jones and Pearson's only disobedience, quote unquote, was in being vocal and unapologetic about gun violence in this nation and about being black. Unfortunately, throughout our history, black people fighting for a stronger democracy and a more perfect union have been silenced and shut down by white supremacy. And when asked to make a choice between democracy and white supremacy, those in the Tennessee legislature chose white supremacy, and ignorantly presuming that this could happen without any attention. But they were wrong. There is a long history of attacks against black legislators going back to the Reconstruction era, or even the case against civil rights advocate Julian Bond and Congressman Adam Clayton Powell. Tennessee Republicans managed to expel 2 duly elected black legislators, but the vote against Representative Johnson, a white woman, failed. We cannot ignore the racial undertones of this incident and the efforts to temporarily disenfranchise black voters and muzzle black voices. Was it the color of these young men's skin, their age, their hair? As a black legislator, I know what it feels like to have to explain my very presence in these spaces. And sadly, my story is not unique. It is the story of individuals in black and brown communities everywhere. That is why I introduced a resolution to immediately condemn the actions of the Tennessee legislature and to recognize this as an attack on the very heart of our democracy. I want to thank Representative Steve Cohen from Tennessee for joining the resolution with me. He is a true advocate for the people of Tennessee. In addition, I am proud to work with my colleagues in the Congressional Black Caucus who reached out to Representatives Jones and Pearson and assured them that they have our support. My colleagues stand by me today as we demand more from a country founded on the principles of liberty and justice for all, because it is clear that we live in a nation where liberty and justice are only granted for some. I am glad that both Representatives Jones and Pearson have been reinstated as interim representatives so that they can continue to serve their constituents. Their municipal governments saw the importance of getting back and getting them back to work. They have it right. The Tennessee House had it wrong. But the fact that it took national outrage and the shaming of the legislature of Tennessee is absurd. I will continue to work with my CBC colleagues to call out attacks on our democracy and black communities across the country as we work to advance racial equity and address the needs of black Americans. Because these young men were fighting to end gun violence. As you have heard, guns are the leading cause of death with children and teens, and black men are 10 times likely to be killed by gun violence. They were speaking truth to reality, and they were silenced. I don't know why the truth is so scary, but that is why I am so proud to be part of the CBC to make sure that we are reminding people of the truth every single day. Thank you, and I yield back.
Prior, how much time is remaining?
2 minutes.
I yield the gentlelady 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you to Chairman Horsford and Representatives Sherflis, McCormick, and Jackson for convening this Congressional Black Caucus special hour. I rise today in solidarity with my CBC colleagues in support of the Tennessee Three and in staunch opposition to the dangerous precedent set by Tennessee Republicans. Just 10 days after 3 children and 3 adults were brutally and tragically murdered, rather than working to prevent that tragedy from happening again, the Tennessee Republicans expelled Representatives Justin Jones and Justin Pearson in a gross abuse of power, a blatant infringement of free speech, and a disenfranchisement of the voters of the 52nd House districts. Attempts to compare the actions of the Tennessee Three to those of January 6 insurrectionists to justify the expulsion trivializes the tragic events that occurred in this very building. Nobody died in the Tennessee House. A bullhorn is not a pipe bomb. Nobody called for members of the Tennessee legislature to be hung. Instead, Tennessee Republicans have set a dangerous precedent that threatens the very foundational principles of American democracy by attempting to silence calls for gun reform. This is something that should concern every voter. A controlling party cannot invalidate the will of the people simply because they don't agree with the position of their colleagues or their peaceful exercise of their free speech. And I stand with my CBC colleagues in denouncing this overreach. We will not stand idly by for such threats on democracy. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.
I yield to our chairman, Stephen Horsford.
I want to thank our co-anchors and all of the members who spoke, and I want to send one very clear message. The actions of the Tennessee legislature, led by the GOP, was a direct assault on our democracy, on people's duly elected representatives. It smacks of overt racism, that they would expel 2 of the youngest black men in their body for simply speaking on behalf of their constituents. This is still an ongoing threat that we should be concerned about, because what happened in the Tennessee legislature was a blow to our democracy, and if it can happen in Nashville, it can happen in communities all over our country. This should concern every American, including my Republican colleagues, because the hallmark of a vibrant and healthy democracy is the very thing that the Republicans in the Tennessee legislature shut down: freedom of speech. The Congressional Black Caucus won't stand by and allow another Jim Crow era to take foot while GOP legislatures abuse their power, as we saw in Tennessee. We stand with the Tennessee Three. We stand with the parents calling for gun violence to end in their communities. We stand for free speech, and we stand for our democracy. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
Yes, thank you. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 9th, 2023, the gentleman from Florida, Mr.